Hi, welcome to the show. Today we've got an interview with a climber who pretty much defines the word legend. It's Piolets Lifetime Achievement Award winner, Sir Chris Bonington. So, Sir Chris Bonington, you've been given the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Piolets d'Or. This is a bit of a huge question, and been in your 60 years of climbing. Do you have any days that stand out for you?
Well, there's a whole series of days inevitably, aren't there? And for my first 5-6 years climbing, I'd never been out of Europe. I'd never been out of England because it was just after the war. So my climbing horizon was the British Isles, and it'd be Wales or the lakes in the winter or spring holidays, and the highlands for the whole of the summer. And I'd just take off and stay in youth hostels, find people to climb with, and the magic days, a different kind of days. One day we went. Do you know the Northwest Highlands at all?
Yeah.
The far northwest, and Sullivan.
Torridon and
yeah,
okay,
when they're further north than that.
Okay.
And we went, and there's two of us. And we were staying in Both, just sleeping in Bothes. Started at Lochinver, and we wanted to do a climb on Sullivan. And it's a long walk, and Sullivan's a magnificent mountain. It's standing on top of this kind of granite, very ancient granite plinth, and then these big mountains jut out of it. So there's a kind of 2.5 hour walk in, and then there's a big buttress at the end. And we couldn't find the route, and so we did a new route in effect. Got to the top of Sullivan, and then our plan was we'd left our rucksacks at the bottom. We traversed the mountain, came back, picked up our rucksacks, and if you go south from Sullivan, there's Loch Shenasgag, which is this huge, wide loch, a very shallow loch, and Stack Polly about 15 miles to the south. And we just took off and walked through the late afternoon, most of the night, to find a little bothy below Stack Polly, and then climbed Stack Polly the next day. And that to me encapsulates the joy of the highlands, and of that kind of exploration and adventure. And I suppose then spreading wings to the Alps, I suppose inevitably, when we did the Southwest Pillar of the Drew back in '68, and by that time I was in the army, and that got me abroad. I was stationed in Germany, and I joined Hamish McInnes, who's at the time one of the best all-round mountaineers Britain had, probably, other than say Joe Brown and Don Willans. And we were climbing together, and we went with a couple of Austrian climbers for the Southwest Pillar. And then that night, two other characters arrived at the Rognon, which is the little bivouac place just below the Drew. And who should it be but Willans and young Paul Ross. At the end of the first day, and there was some really hard climbing then, and Don was out in front with Paul Ross, and he led one rope length, which Bonatti, admitted, of course, when Bonatti on the first ascent it was solo, but he had climbed with aid up this corner, and Don climbed the whole thing free. And then it was my turn with Hamish, and I led it, and there was practically no protection whatsoever. And I remember about 10 foot below the top of the pitch, and that was the point where if I'd fallen, it would have been curtains. And I said, "Could I have a top rope, please?" And Dodd dropped me a top rope. Anyway, so we got up there. So we'd done about the first third of the climb, and we were settling down for the bivouac that night. And then just before we were ready to kind of brew up our tea, there's this huge rock fall from the Flamme de Fier down the approach gully that you have to go up to climb the Southwest Pillar. And there must be hundreds of thousands of tons of rock. So obviously, if it had happened when we were going up, we'd have been killed for certain. And then that had all settled. And then there was this one kind of high-pitched whine. It was just one solitary little stone from somewhere high up on the Southwest Pillar. and it landed on top of Hamish's head. And in those days, we didn't use crash hats. And I think, I'm not even sure he had his cloth cap on. But anyway, he was knocked unconscious. And he had, in fact, cracked his skull. And he was very, very groggy the next day. But I mean, there's no way we were going to descend that gully after we'd seen. So, and it was here Don took over. And so Don took on Hamish. The two Austrians did the leading. And then Paul and I brought up the rear. And Don, as well as leading all the pitches, literally hauled Hamish up the southwest pillar. And that's where our friendship started. And we then, you know, did an awful lot of climbing with him. And I learned a huge amount from Don.
So in the time you've been climbing, how do you feel climbing has changed?
I would say, well, it's inevitably evolved. Nothing stays the same. I mean, that's one thing that's absolutely certain. And each generation has got to find ways of developing what they're doing. I mean, in all forms of human activity, and in climbing, it means that each generation's got to find harder and harder things to do. I think my generation that came to maturity just after the Second World War, I think we had a fantastic kind of opportunity. If you think of it, well, none of the 8,000 metre peaks have been climbed for a start. And even here in the Alps, there were so many outstanding routes just waiting to be done. And I think, therefore, my generation had this, we could do the big, obvious kind of lines, and there were big obvious lines still in the Alps. In the Himalayas, things had hardly been touched at all. And so that we were able to do all of those things. And now I think today, you've got it, I mean, even in the Himalayas, it's not just that all the 8,000 metre peaks have been climbed, but pretty well every single ridge and facet of those 8,000 metres peaks have been climbed. And so that the climber to evolve and develop, which they have done, I mean, I think I suppose part of my development was in the 70s in the Himalayas of going for the big faces like everyone was. And of course, we went siege style because that's how everyone had done it. And probably that was the logical way to do it at that time. And then the next logical step, which Reinhard Messner started really with his Alpine-style ascent on Gesherbrum 2, was doing a hard new route, pure Alpine-style on the 8,000 metre peak. And now, of course, I mean, you know, the fact that, say, on the South Face van der Purne, we thought we were quite a lightweight expedition. I mean, we had 8 climbers. We only used half a dozen Sherpas who only worked on the lower part of the mountain because they'd never climbed anything like that before, using siege tactics. And we were 6 or 7 weeks on the mountain, and when he goes and does that extraordinary route up the side of the South Face van der Purne, it's a bloody impressive looking line. Yeah. And in what was it, 24, 25 hours?
Something like that, yeah.
And it was, and that is the way things have developed. And it's a different style of climbing. It's incredibly impressive. And I think what the modern elite in climbing is doing at the moment is quite extraordinary.
This is maybe an impossible question, but if for the next Sir Chris Bonington, he's 18 now and he's got 60 years of climbing ahead of him, where will climbing be then? Where is the logical step? Because it seems, you know, you look at what Uli did on Annapurna, you wonder how far there is to go with it.
I just don't think you can predict. And that is, I mean, with pretty well all human advances, 10 years ago you couldn't. And also not just human, political advances as well. Who on earth would have predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall? Who would have predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union? And so on. So that, you know, it is very, very difficult to predict that. What you can be quite sure of is it'll be different.
You think there is still a huge scope for climbing to advance? And
I think there probably must be. I think both were climbing, there's a huge potential for climbing to develop it. In fact, there's so many places in the Himalayas particularly, but in all the further ranges, there's still a huge amount of climbing to be done. The problem is that the climbing to be done is immensely interesting and fascinating, but it's very difficult for the general public to get their heads around it, because the general public and the media, on the whole, need nice, obvious things. They need simple superlatives, the highest mountain on earth, the longest route on earth, and so on. All of those things have been done, and so now what climbers are doing is that they're perfecting, they're doing alterations on how to do it, they're base jumping from the top of the climbs and so on. And all of these things, I think, are actually in some ways quite healthy, because the real development of climbing is going away from the popular media. They can't get their heads around it at all. And so it becomes very much our own climbers' game, which probably only a fairly small part of the climbing community even can get their heads around. And climbing has become so diffuse as well. There's so many different, we've got so many different rules that we play by. I mean, the difference between the development of sport climbing and adventure climbing. And each are worthy in their own way, except being an old trad climber myself, I would rather wish that sport climbers had stopped putting boat ladders up lovely stretches of rock on either side of a beautiful natural line.
so just going back to this 18-year-old who's starting out now, if you could give them one piece of advice, what would it be? Someone's getting into climbing.
I'd say learn your craft and put right at the back of your mind climbing Everest, and actually focus on firstly getting good at climbing in your own back door, whether it's whether you live in Paris or Düsseldorf or London or Seattle. And start getting rock climbing, getting into general mountaineering, and if you're a Brit, get up to Scotland and do some winter climbing, then get to the Alps. And the Alps is a wonderful transition for the big mountains, and become competent there. And then go off to the greater ranges, go to the Himalayas. And if you go to the Himalayas though, by that time you've learnt your craft, so there's no need whatsoever to go on onto a commercial trip. Go with your mates who know as little or as much about it as yourself, and bumble up something, and really develop within your own experience as far as you want to, because you might want to be able to do the hardest climbs there are. You might be perfectly, but the vast majority of people are perfectly happy to climb in different levels of zones. Well, stay in those zones, and if you feel like pushing it, okay, push up the next zone and so on. But it's essentially, and it's getting fun from climbing, I think. But you also need, within that fun, you also, well no, not all of us need. Some of us need challenge, and some of us need a lot of challenge, and some of us don't need any at all. Well, be happy with what you're doing. No, the key thing is enjoy it.
Thanks to Sir Chris for chatting to us, and congratulations on a long overdue and well-deserved award. That's it from us today. We will see you tomorrow.